They were just two grandparents trying to see the northern lights one last time before their bodies gave out. But when the deadliest blizzard in recorded history trapped them at -71 degrees Celsius, what kept them alive wasn't just their winter survival tent, it was what lay frozen beneath it. A secret worth $245 million that powerful men had buried decades ago and would kill to keep hidden. Before we explore this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The frost on the windshield looked like shattered diamonds in the late afternoon sun. Robert Hayes sat in the driver's seat of their 30-year-old pickup truck, hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee that had long gone cold. Beside him, Martha Hayes hummed softly to a song only she could hear, her weathered fingers tracing patterns on the foggy passenger window. They were both in their early 70s, bodies worn by decades of hard work and harder winters, but their eyes still sparkled with something most people lose by 40, wonder. Robert had worked as a lineman for the power company for 43 years. Every morning before dawn, he'd climb poles in rain, snow, and scorching heat to keep the lights on for people who never knew his name. His hands were calloused from gripping metal and wire, his back permanently curved from years of carrying heavy equipment up ladders that swayed in the wind. But he'd never complained, not once, because the work had meaning and the paycheck kept his family fed. Martha had been a schoolteacher in the same small Montana town where they'd raised 3 children. For 38 years, she'd stood in front of classrooms full of restless kids, teaching them grammar and literature, and, more importantly, that they mattered. She'd spent her own money on supplies when the school budget ran dry, stayed late to tutor students who struggled, and attended every single graduation of every single class she'd taught. Her reward had been modest, a pension that barely covered basics, and the knowledge that somewhere out there were hundreds of people whose lives were better because she'd cared. They'd saved carefully, lived modestly, and now in retirement, their greatest luxury was time. Time to drive, time to dream, time to chase one last adventure before arthritis and age made adventures impossible. Their 3 children were grown with families of their own. Grace lived in Billings with her husband and 2 teenage boys. Michael had moved to Seattle for work and called every Sunday without fail. And Sarah, their youngest, taught at a university in Colorado, following in her mother's footsteps. The plan for this trip had been simple. Drive north through the Canadian wilderness, camp in the backcountry, and witness the aurora borealis from a place so remote that light pollution couldn't steal its magic. They'd done their research, spent weeks poring over maps and weather patterns, reading forums where other retirees shared their own northern adventures. They'd packed their winter survival gear with the methodical care of people who understood that nature didn't care about good intentions. Robert had insisted on bringing the winter survival tent, military grade, rated for extreme cold, the kind used by Arctic researchers. It had cost them $800, a fortune on their fixed income, but Robert had been adamant. If we're going that far north, he'd said, we prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Martha had rolled her eyes at the expense but packed it anyway, along with enough freeze-dried meals to feed a small army, extra batteries for their flashlights, and hand warmers that she'd bought on sale the previous winter. They'd left their modest home in Whitefish, Montana, 3 days earlier, with full hearts and modest expectations. The house had belonged to Martha's parents before them, a small 2-bedroom with creaky floors and a furnace that had needed repairs for the past 5 years, but kept limping along. They'd raised their children in that house, celebrated holidays, weathered storms, buried pets in the backyard, and built a life that felt complete, even if it never felt wealthy. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered wilderness in shades of orange and purple, Robert checked the map one more time. They were deep into the Northern Territories, at least 80 miles from the nearest town, following an old mining road that barely qualified as a path. The landscape was breathtaking, endless white interrupted only by skeletal pines and jagged rock formations that looked like the bones of ancient giants. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their tires on snow and the occasional cry of a raven overhead. "We should find a spot soon," Martha said quietly, her breath visible in the cold cab despite the heater running full blast. "Weather report said clear skies tonight." "Perfect for the lights," Robert nodded, but something in his gut twisted. He'd spent decades reading weather, not from apps or forecasts, but from the sky itself, the way clouds moved, the smell of the air, the behavior of birds. And right now, everything felt wrong. The wind had shifted in the last hour, coming from the northwest with a bite that suggested something bigger than a cold front. The sky to the north, where they were headed, had darkened to a bruised purple-gray that made his weathered instincts scream warning. He'd learned to trust those instincts 43 years ago, when he'd been a young lineman, new to the job and eager to prove himself. An older worker named Dale had pulled him aside one morning when storm clouds gathered and said, "Kid, the weather service might say it's safe to work, but my bones say different. Learn to listen to what nature's telling you, or you won't make it to retirement." Dale had been right that day. A storm had rolled in 2 hours ahead of predictions, and Robert had carried that lesson with him ever since. "Maybe we should turn back," he said carefully, his eyes scanning the darkening northern horizon. "Find a motel in town, try again tomorrow." Martha looked at him, really looked, and saw the concern in his eyes. After 52 years of marriage, she could read him like a well-worn book, better than any novel she'd ever assigned to her students. "You're worried." "I'm cautious," he corrected, though his grip on the steering wheel had tightened. "There's a difference." She reached over and squeezed his hand, her fingers thin and papery now, but still strong. "Your cautious has kept us safe for half a century. If you think we should turn back, we turn back." But even as she said it, the wind picked up with sudden violence, rocking the old truck on its suspension. The temperature gauge on the dashboard began to plummet, -20 Celsius, -25, -30. The drop was so rapid it seemed impossible, like watching a thermometer in freefall. Robert's weathered face paled as he watched the numbers descend. Robert's hands tightened on the wheel. "Hold on." The blizzard hit like a freight train made of ice and fury. One moment, they could see the road ahead, the winding path through pine trees and open clearings. The next, they were engulfed in a whiteout, so complete that the headlights became useless, reflecting back nothing but swirling white chaos. It was like being inside a snow globe that someone had shaken with violent rage. The wind howled like a living thing, battering the truck from all sides with fists of compressed air, and the temperature continued its horrifying descent. Robert fought the wheel, trying to keep them on what he hoped was still the road, but visibility was zero. Snow so thick it looked solid, slammed against the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. Each swipe of the blades revealed nothing but more white, an endless assault of ice crystals moving with such velocity they sounded like gravel hitting metal. The truck's heater began to lose its battle against the invading cold. Martha wrapped her coat tighter around herself, her face pale but calm. She'd married a man who stayed steady in crisis, and she trusted him completely. "I need to stop," Robert said through gritted teeth, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Can't see anything. If we drive off the road out here, we're done." He eased the truck to what he hoped was the shoulder, feeling blindly for the edge of the path with his tires. When he felt resistance on the right side, he stopped completely and killed the engine to conserve fuel. The moment the engine died, they immediately felt the cold begin its assault. Within minutes, frost crept across the inside of the windows, like living things, delicate patterns that would have been beautiful in any other circumstance. The temperature gauge now read -45 Celsius, and it was still dropping with the relentless precision of a countdown to something terrible. "The tent," Martha said, already reaching for her gloves with shaking fingers. "We need to set it up now, before it gets worse." They'd practiced this before, back in their yard on a mild autumn afternoon, much to the amusement of their neighbors who'd watched through their windows, probably thinking the old Hayes couple had finally lost their minds. Mrs. Peterson next door had even come out to ask if everything was all right, eyeing their military-grade survival tent with obvious concern. But Robert had insisted they know how to set it up quickly, had made them practice until Martha could do it with her eyes closed. The winter survival tent was designed for exactly this: sudden, life-threatening cold. It was a double-walled shelter with a thermal core, small enough to heat with body warmth, and a single camping stove, strong enough to withstand hurricane-force winds. The specifications said it could keep 2 people alive in temperatures down to -60 Celsius, but setting it up in a blizzard at -50 Celsius and dropping would test every ounce of their strength and experience. It would test whether 2 people in their 70s had the physical capability to save their own lives. Robert grabbed the tent bag from the truck bed, his face immediately stung by wind-driven ice crystals that felt like needles being driven into his skin. The cold was so intense it burned, a paradox that would have fascinated Martha the teacher in any other moment. Martha gathered their sleeping bags, the stove, and emergency supplies, moving with the efficient urgency of someone who understood the stakes completely. They had maybe 10 minutes before the cold became fatal, maybe less. Their bodies, already old and vulnerable, would succumb faster than younger people would. The world was a screaming white nightmare. Robert couldn't see more than a foot in front of his face. The wind shrieked like something alive and furious, tearing at his coat, stealing his breath. He stumbled, caught himself against the truck's cold metal, and began driving the tent stakes into the frozen ground with a mallet, each strike requiring all his remaining strength. The ground resisted, frozen solid, and he had to strike each stake a dozen times before it would penetrate even a few inches. Martha held the tent fabric, preventing the wind from ripping it from his hands. Her face already going numb, despite the balaclava covering everything but her eyes. She could feel the moisture from her breath freezing on the fabric, creating a shell of ice around her mouth and nose. Her fingers, even through thick gloves, were losing sensation. She focused on counting her breaths, a technique she'd used to calm nervous students before tests. Breathe in for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. Stay present. Stay focused. Stay alive. Time became meaningless. Seconds felt like hours. Hours might have been seconds. All that mattered was getting the shelter up, getting inside, surviving the next moment and the one after that. Robert's hands fumbled with frozen fingers, but muscle memory from decades of outdoor work guided him through. His father had taught him to camp when he was 7 years old, had drilled into him that preparation and practice were what kept you alive when nature turned hostile. Click, lock, secure. The tent frame snapped into place with sounds that were barely audible over the roar of wind. They crawled inside just as the full fury of the storm descended. The sound was apocalyptic, a roar so loud it felt like standing inside an engine. But inside the tent, with the doors zipped shut and the thermal layers providing a fragile barrier against the killing cold, they had a chance. Just a chance, but after 52 years of marriage, of building a life together through hard times and harder winters, a chance was all they'd ever asked for. Robert fired up the small camping stove, with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped the lighter. The blue flame flickered to life. A tiny declaration of defiance against the ice trying to kill them. Martha spread out the sleeping bags with mechanical precision, her teacher's organizational mind taking over even as her body shook from cold and adrenaline. The temperature gauge they'd brought registered the outside air at -63 Celsius. Inside the tent, it was -20 and climbing slowly, painfully slowly, as the stove worked and their body heat began to accumulate in the small space. They sat close together, sharing warmth, their bodies pressed against each other the way they'd slept for 5 decades. Neither spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say that wasn't already understood. They'd gambled on one last adventure and rolled snake eyes. Now, survival was the only prize that mattered. Everything else, the northern lights, the adventure, the romance of it all, had been reduced to a simple equation: Could they keep warm enough to see morning? Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The storm didn't relent. If anything, it intensified, as if nature itself was personally offended by their presence. Robert checked the temperature gauge periodically, watching in horror as it dropped to -68, then -70, then -71 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, exposed skin would freeze in under 2 minutes. Frostbite would be instantaneous and devastating. Their truck, parked just feet away, might as well have been on another planet. If they tried to reach it, they would die before they could turn the key. Martha pulled their sleeping bags tighter around them, creating a cocoon that held their body heat. They were burning through fuel canisters at an alarming rate, each one giving them maybe 90 minutes of warmth before it needed to be changed. Robert had packed 6. They'd already used 3. "Tell me something good," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold air. "Tell me about the first time you knew." Robert smiled despite everything, despite the cold trying to kill them, despite the very real possibility they might not see another sunrise. "Knew what?" "That you loved me." He was quiet for a moment, the storm raging outside, death waiting just beyond the tent fabric that seemed impossibly thin against such brutal cold. "Sophomore year. You were helping Mrs. Peterson clean up after the science fair. Everyone else had left, but you stayed because you saw a kid standing alone by his volcano project. You told him it was the best one there, that sometimes judges don't see what really matters." The way his face lit up, I knew right then that I wanted to spend my life with someone who made people feel seen. Martha's eyes filled with tears that would have frozen on her cheeks if she'd been outside. "That boy was Tommy Richardson. He became a geologist, wrote me a letter 20 years later saying that night changed his life. Said he'd been about to give up on science because his father told him he wasn't smart enough, but my words made him keep trying. See?" Robert pulled her closer, feeling how fragile she'd become in their 70s, all bone and thin flesh, where there used to be more substance. "You've been changing lives since before you even knew it." They held each other as the temperature outside reached its lowest point, -71 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to freeze gasoline solid, cold enough to shatter metal, cold enough to kill dreams and people with equal indifference. The tent groaned under the assault, ice building up on the exterior with such speed that it became a frozen fortress. The small stove burned through their fuel canisters one by one. Each one bought them hours they wouldn't have had otherwise, hours that might be the difference between life and death. Sometime deep in the night, when exhaustion and cold had blurred the line between waking and dreaming, when Robert wasn't sure if he was alive or dying or somewhere in between, he felt something strange. A vibration, subtle but distinct, coming through the frozen ground beneath them. At first, he thought it was the storm, the way massive winds can make the earth itself seem to tremble. But no, this was different, rhythmic, almost mechanical, like something deep underground, something that had no business being in the middle of nowhere. He sat up carefully, trying not to disturb Martha, who'd finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. He pressed his ear to the tent floor, listening. There it was again. A low-frequency hum, like machinery buried deep, like something that had been running for years or decades, waiting. The vibration came in waves, each one lasting maybe 10 seconds before fading, then returning 30 seconds later with mechanical precision. He decided not to mention it. Probably just his exhausted mind playing tricks, or the strange acoustics of extreme cold, doing things to sound and that he didn't understand. Or maybe hypothermia was setting in despite their precautions, making him hallucinate sensations that weren't real. He lay back down, pulled Martha close, and let his eyes drift shut. They'd made it through the worst of it. Morning would come, the storm would pass, they would survive. He had no idea that beneath them, encased in permafrost and ice, lay a secret that would turn their survival story into something far more complicated. No idea that the ground under their tent had been chosen decades ago for a very specific reason by people with very specific intentions. No idea that the vibration he'd felt was a fail-safe system, still active after all these years, designed to protect a fortune that powerful men thought they'd hidden forever. The storm finally broke just before dawn. The howling wind gradually diminished to a whisper. Then to silence so complete it felt holy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Robert woke first, his body aching in ways that reminded him he was 73 and had just survived something that would have killed most people half his age. He unzipped the tent door carefully and looked out at a world transformed. Everything was white. Not the white of fresh snow that children play in, but the white of total domination. Drifts towered 12 feet high in some places, smooth and sculpted by wind into shapes that looked almost intentional, almost artistic. Their truck was buried completely, just a vague mound visible where he knew it should be, like a burial cairn marking where their vehicle had died. The sky above was pale blue, crystal clear, mocking them with its serenity after the violence of the night, but they were alive. Against all odds, against temperatures that should have killed them, against a blizzard that meteorologists would later call a once-in-a-century event, two grandparents in a tent had survived minus 71 degrees Celsius. Martha stirred, opened her eyes, saw Robert silhouetted against the morning light like a prophet at the entrance to salvation. "We made it," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the dry, cold air. "We made it," he confirmed, his own voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "Now we just need to dig out the truck, hope it starts, and get the hell out of here." They ate a sparse breakfast of protein bars and melted snow, rationing their remaining supplies. They had 3 more fuel canisters for the stove, maybe enough for another day if they were careful, but the temperature had risen to a almost balmy minus 30 Celsius. Robert began the arduous process of digging out their truck, each shovel full of snow requiring effort that reminded him he was 73 and feeling every year of it. His back protested with each movement. His shoulders, damaged from decades of climbing power poles, screamed at him to stop. But he kept going because stopping wasn't an option. They were 80 miles from help, and their supplies wouldn't last more than another day. He dug methodically, trying to conserve energy, stopping every few minutes to rest and breathe. That's when he noticed it. A crack in the ground, just a few feet from where they'd set up the tent. Not a natural crack, but something too straight, too deliberate, like a seam in concrete. The extreme cold and the vibration he'd felt during the night must have created just enough stress to reveal what had been hidden beneath inches of permafrost and frozen soil. He knelt down, his knees protesting, and brushed away snow and ice with his gloved hands. The crack was maybe 3 feet long, perfectly straight, and when he cleared more snow, he saw it formed a square. There was metal down there. Smooth, manufactured metal that reflected the morning sun with the dull gleam of something that had been underground for a very long time. He looked back at Martha, who'd stepped out of the tent and was watching him with curious eyes that still held the sharpness that had kept generations of students in line. "Martha," he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd just found something that didn't make sense. "I think you should see this." She walked over, each step crunching through the surface crust of snow, her breath visible in the cold air. She knelt beside him, her teacher's mind immediately shifting into analytical mode, the way she used to examine students' work for clues about their thinking. She saw what he saw, and her breath caught. "What is that?" "I don't know, but it doesn't belong here." Robert went back to the truck, retrieved a small pry bar from his emergency kit, a tool he'd carried for 43 years of lineman work, and returned to the crack. He wedged the bar into the gap and applied pressure, using his weight and what remained of his strength. The frozen earth resisted, held firm, then suddenly gave way with a sound like breaking glass. A section of metal paneling, maybe 3 feet square, popped up slightly with a hiss of released air. Beneath it was a hatch, industrial, heavy-duty, with a wheel lock that looked like something from a submarine or a bank vault. And stamped into the metal, barely visible under decades of oxidation and weathering, were numbers 1987. Robert and Martha looked at each other. They'd been married long enough to communicate entire conversations with a single glance. To share thoughts without words, through nothing but the movement of eyes and the set of mouths. This glance said, "We're already in too deep to pretend we didn't see this." This glance said, "Our lives just became more complicated." This glance said, "Whatever happens next will change everything." Robert gripped the wheel lock with both hands, his calloused fingers searching for purchase on metal that had been frozen for longer than some of his grandchildren had been alive. The cold bit through his gloves, making his arthritis flare with sharp stabs of pain, but he kept pressure on it, working it back and forth with the patient determination of a man who'd spent 4 decades fixing things that didn't want to be fixed. Martha knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, both of them breathing hard in the thin, frigid air. The wheel resisted at first, frozen and seized by years of ice and time and deliberate concealment. Robert's shoulders trembled with effort, his breath coming in short gasps that turned to white clouds in the -30-degree air. Then something deep inside the mechanism gave way with a metallic groan that sounded almost organic, almost alive. The wheel began to rotate, 1 full turn, 2, 3. Then, with a hiss of released pressure that seemed impossible after all these years, the hatch cracked open. Cold air rushed out, but not the cold of the blizzard that had nearly killed them. This was different, dry and preserved, the kind of cold that keeps things exactly as they were left, like a cryogenic chamber or a tomb. It smelled of metal and earth and something else, something chemical that Robert couldn't quite place. Martha handed him a flashlight from their supplies, her hands shaking slightly, though whether from cold or anticipation or fear, neither of them could say. Robert pulled the hatch fully open, the hinges protesting with sounds that suggested they hadn't moved in decades. He looked down into darkness that seemed to swallow light, a shaft descending into the earth like a throat. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, revealing a ladder leading down maybe 15 feet, each rung made of the same industrial metal as the hatch. At the bottom, Robert could make out what looked like a chamber, walls lined with something reflective, panels that caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in strange patterns. His hands trembled as he tested the first rung of the ladder. It held his weight, solid despite the years underground. He looked at Martha, saw his own mix of fear and curiosity reflected in her weathered face. "I'm going down," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Stay here. If anything happens, leave me and walk to the nearest town." "Promise me." "Like hell," Martha replied, her teacher's voice brooking no argument, the same tone she'd used to quiet rowdy classrooms for 38 years. 52 years, Robert. We don't split up now, not for anything." So they descended together, 2 elderly people who should have been home drinking coffee and watching morning news, climbing down into a frozen vault that shouldn't exist in the middle of nowhere. Robert went first, testing each rung carefully before putting his full weight on it, conscious that a fall could mean a broken bone and death by exposure. Martha followed, moving with the careful precision of someone who understood that at 72, her body didn't forgive mistakes the way it used to. At the bottom, Robert swept the flashlight around in a slow arc, and both of them gasped. The sound echoed in the confined space, bouncing off walls that had been engineered to last, to preserve, to protect. The chamber was perhaps 20 feet across, carved from stone, and lined with waterproof panels that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. The ceiling was reinforced with steel beams, the kind used in mine shafts or military bunkers. But what filled their vision, what made Martha's hand fly to her mouth and Robert's breath catch in his throat, were the containers. Dozens of them, each one roughly the size of a large suitcase, stacked in neat rows with military precision. They were military-style cases, the kind designed to survive drops from aircraft or submersion in water, sealed against moisture and time with rubber gaskets and heavy-duty latches. Each case was labeled with a number and a letter combination painted in white stencil, a one, a 2, a 3, continuing in orderly progression. The floor was concrete, perfectly level, with drainage channels cut into the corners. This wasn't a hasty burial. This was engineering, planning, intention. Martha approached the nearest case, while Robert kept the flashlight steady, his hand unconsciously clenching and unclenching around the metal cylinder. The case had a simple latch, military issue, no lock visible. She looked back at Robert, asking permission with her eyes. He nodded slowly. She opened it carefully, the latch releasing with a click that sounded obscenely loud in the underground silence. Inside, wrapped in weatherproof plastic that had kept out every drop of moisture for decades, were bundles of cash. $100 bills, crisp and perfect despite their age, packed so tightly they looked like bricks of green paper. Each bundle was bound with paper bands printed with numbers, $10,000. Martha counted quickly with her teacher's mind. 20 bundles, $200,000 in a single case. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Oh my God. Robert moved to another case, his hands shaking now for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. He opened it with fumbling fingers. The same. Stacks of hundreds, perfectly preserved, perfectly organized. And another. The same and another. Every single container they opened held the same thing. Money. More money than they'd ever seen outside of a bank vault. More money than they'd ever imagined being in one place. Certainly more money than 2 retired workers from Montana had ever dreamed of touching. They opened 6 cases in stunned silence before Robert's flashlight beam caught something else. On the wall, mounted on a metal placard that had resisted the decades better than it should have, was a document protected behind a thick plastic cover. He moved closer, wiping dust from the plastic with his glove. Martha joined him, and together they read words that had been typed on a typewriter decades ago. Each letter struck into paper with mechanical precision. Emergency Fund. Authorization. Code 773. Baker. Deployment Contingency. For Operation Northwind. Amount. $245 million. Status. Active. Verification. Pending. Date sealed. November 12, 1987. Recovery authorization. Colonel Douglas Brennan, United States Armed Forces Special Operations Command. Next, scheduled inspection. June 1, 1991. In event of national emergency, access codes available through designated military channels only. $245 million. The number sat between them like a living thing, too large to comprehend, too real to dismiss. Robert's mind raced through possibilities, questions, fears, implications that branched out like a tree with infinite roots. This wasn't buried treasure from pirates or a hidden stash from bank robbers. This was military, governmental, official. The kind of official that came with protocols, and people who enforced those protocols with extreme prejudice. The kind of official that made people disappear when they stumbled onto things they shouldn't have found. Martha carefully closed the case she'd opened, her teacher's mind already working through the implications with the same analytical process she'd used to grade papers and plan lessons. We need to report this. To who? Robert asked, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't quite name. We're 80 miles from the nearest town. We barely survived the night. Our truck might not even start, and if we tell anyone about this, he trailed off, but they both understood. People who buried this much money in a frozen wasteland. People who used terms like deployment contingency and special operations command weren't the kind of people who'd appreciate it being found by 2 elderly strangers who'd camped in the wrong place at the wrong time. They stood in silence for a long moment, the flashlight beam creating dancing shadows on the metal walls. The temperature in the chamber was cold but stable, probably hovering right around freezing, cold enough to preserve, but not cold enough to damage. Robert moved slowly around the space, counting cases. 47 in total. If each held roughly the same amount as the ones they'd opened, and they'd already estimated one case at around $200,000 based on Martha's quick count, then yes, the placard's number was accurate. $245 million, give or take, sitting in a hole in the ground where it had been forgotten or abandoned or deliberately hidden for 36 years. Martha had moved to a corner where a metal cabinet sat bolted to the wall. She opened it carefully, finding more documents in waterproof folders. Robert joined her, and together they examined what looked like operational plans, maps with coordinates marked in red, lists of other locations with cryptic designations. There were at least 20 other sites marked on the maps, scattered across Canada and the northern United States. Each one had a code name and an estimated value. The implications were staggering. This wasn't an isolated cache. This was part of a network. This was Cold War. Martha said softly, her historian's mind connecting dots from decades of reading and teaching about that era. They were preparing for Soviet invasion, for occupation. These caches were meant to fund resistance movements if America fell. Robert nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him. He'd been in his 20s during the height of Cold War tensions, had watched news reports about nuclear drills and bomb shelters and the constant fear that shaped that generation. They buried money all over North America, insurance against the worst-case scenario. A scenario that never happened. Martha added, the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, these caches became irrelevant, and this one, she gestured around the chamber, was apparently forgotten. The next inspection was scheduled for June 1, 1991. But if that inspection happened, they would have recovered it. We wouldn't be standing here, so either they never came back, Robert said slowly, or they decided it wasn't worth recovering. Maybe the program was shut down before the inspection date. Maybe the paperwork was lost in some bureaucratic shuffle. Maybe the people who knew about it retired, or died, or were reassigned. Or maybe, Martha said, her voice carrying a note that made Robert turn to look at her fully. Someone decided to leave it here, intentionally. They climbed back up the ladder slowly, both of them processing what they'd discovered, what it meant, what dangers it represented. At the surface, the morning sun was fully up now, the temperature slowly rising into the bearable range of -25. They sealed the hatch, pushed snow over it, tried to make it look undisturbed, but both of them knew it was futile. They'd opened something that had been closed for 36 years. Someone, somewhere, might know. That vibration Robert had felt during the night, that rhythmic mechanical hum, suggested monitoring equipment, fail-safes, systems designed to alert someone if the cache was accessed. They climbed into the truck, Robert turning the key with a prayer on his lips. The engine coughed, protested, then caught and roared to life. Thank God for simple mechanics and reliable American engineering. They let it warm up while they sat in silence, both staring at the snow-covered mound that hid $245 million in cold, hard cash. We could just leave, Robert finally said. Not tell anyone. Go home, forget we ever saw it. Live out our lives, not knowing what happens next. Could you do that? Martha asked quietly, turning to face him with those sharp eyes that had seen through every excuse, every half-truth, every attempt at deception from 3 children and hundreds of students. Could you really just walk away and pretend you didn't see $245 million buried by people who clearly didn't want it found? He was quiet for a long time, watching the steam rise from the truck's hood into the cold air. Then he shook his head slowly. No, I couldn't. Neither could I, she said. So what do we do? The answer didn't come immediately. They sat for another 20 minutes, engine running, heater finally pushing warm air into the cab, both of them thinking through options and consequences. Finally, Robert spoke. We document everything, take pictures, write down exactly what we found and where. Then we drive to the nearest town and think. We don't make any decisions while we're still in shock, still exhausted, still processing what just happened. Martha nodded. It was practical, careful, exactly the kind of approach that had gotten them through 52 years of marriage and raised 3 successful children on 2 modest incomes. They spent the next hour working systematically. Robert took photographs with his old flip phone, the pictures grainy and low resolution but clear enough to show the hatch, the numbers stamped on it, the date. They documented the GPS coordinates from their truck's navigation system, wrote them down in Martha's ever-present notebook along with detailed descriptions of the location, the terrain, the landmarks. Then Robert made a decision that would change everything. He climbed back down into the vault one more time, this time with a clear purpose. He opened 3 of the cases, removed his gloves despite the cold, and carefully examined the money. The bills were genuine, he could tell that much. The paper felt right, the printing was crisp, the security features looked authentic. He took photographs of serial numbers, of the paper bands binding the stacks, of everything he could think of that might be important later. He also did something else, something he didn't tell Martha about immediately. He took one bundle from one case, $10,000. It felt like nothing, a tiny fraction of the total. But it was also more money than they'd ever held at one time. He justified it to himself as evidence, as proof, as insurance. But deep down, he knew it was something else. It was a choice, the first small step down a path that would either save them or destroy them. When he climbed back up, tucking the bundle inside his jacket where Martha couldn't see it, he found her on the phone with their daughter, Grace. He could hear the worry in Grace's voice even from several feet away, could hear Martha carefully explaining that they were fine, that the storm had been bad but they'd been prepared, that they were heading to a town to rest before driving home. She was lying by omission, not mentioning the discovery, and Robert felt a stab of guilt. They'd never hidden things from their children before. They drove away from the site slowly, Robert checking his mirrors compulsively, half expecting to see vehicles pursuing them, or helicopters overhead, or some sign that they'd triggered an alarm. But there was nothing, just empty wilderness and blowing snow and the endless white expanse of northern Canada. The drive to Whitehorse took them 6 hours, the roads partially cleared but still dangerous, requiring Robert's full concentration. They didn't talk much during the drive, both lost in their own thoughts, both trying to process the impossible situation they'd stumbled into. By the time they pulled into a small motel parking lot on the outskirts of town, exhaustion had replaced their adrenaline completely. They checked into a room that smelled of pine cleaner and old carpet, paid cash because Robert had always preferred cash, and immediately Martha collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. But her mind wouldn't stop working, couldn't stop analyzing. She pulled out her laptop, one of the few concessions to modern technology she'd accepted when the school had given her one at retirement, Operation Northwind. She typed into the search engine, her fingers moving with the practiced precision of someone who'd spent years typing lesson plans and grade reports. The results were sparse, frustrating. A few references to Cold War contingency plans, most of them heavily redacted government documents that had been declassified decades later, but with all the interesting parts blacked out. But piecing together fragments from various sources, a picture began to emerge that made her breath catch. Operation Northwind had been a top-secret initiative launched in the mid-1980s during the height of Cold War tensions, when Ronald Reagan was president and the Soviet Union was still seen as an existential threat. It involved creating hidden reserves of cash, equipment, and supplies throughout remote locations in North America, primarily in Canada and Alaska, areas that would be strategically important if the Soviets invaded through the Arctic. The idea was simple but paranoid. If the United States fell to a Soviet invasion, these caches would fund resistance movements, supply insurgent operations, and ensure that America could fight back, even from occupied territory. Dozens of such caches had reportedly been created, funded through black budgets and classified appropriations that never appeared in public records. The program had supposedly been shut down after the Cold War ended, the caches recovered, and the money returned to general funds. But as with many government operations, apparently not all of them had been accounted for. Some had been forgotten, lost to budget cuts and changing administrations, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic failure and deliberate obscurity. And some, Martha was beginning to suspect, had been deliberately left in place by people who had their own reasons for wanting them to stay hidden. She found an obituary from 5 years ago for a Colonel Douglas Brennan, retired Air Force, decorated veteran, survived by his wife and 2 daughters. The obituary was brief, mentioning his long career in military logistics and special operations, but providing no details about specific programs or assignments. But the name matched the one on the placard in the vault. This was the man who'd authorized the burial of $245 million in a frozen hole in the ground. Robert had been watching over her shoulder, reading along. He's dead, so whoever buried that money can't tell us why it's still there. Maybe, Martha said slowly, her teacher's instinct telling her there was more to find. She kept searching, diving deeper into obscure forums and declassified documents and academic papers about Cold War spending. And finally, she found it, a reference to Colonel Brennan in a footnote of a paper about waste and accountability in military black operations programs. The footnote mentioned that Brennan had testified before a closed congressional hearing in 1991, arguing against a proposed recovery operation for remaining Operation Northwind caches. He'd claimed the cost of retrieval would exceed the value of what was buried. That makes no sense, Robert said. $245 million, and the cost of recovery is too high. You could send a team out there for $10,000 and come back with millions. Unless, Martha said, her voice thoughtful, the real cost wasn't financial. Maybe it was political. Maybe recovering the caches would have raised questions about how much money had really been spent on the program, where it all went, how much oversight there had been. Maybe it was easier to write it off as lost than to admit how much taxpayer money had been buried in holes and forgotten. Robert sat down heavily on the bed beside her, his body finally registering just how exhausted he was. They'd survived a blizzard that should have killed them, then discovered a secret that could get them killed in an entirely different way. His mind felt overloaded, unable to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. The bundle of cash inside his jacket felt like it was burning through the fabric, accusing him. "Martha," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him, saw the guilt in his eyes, and immediately understood. "You took some," he nodded, pulling out the bundle and placing it on the bed between them. $10,000 in $100 bills, still bound with its paper band. Just one bundle. I told myself it was evidence, but I know what it really is. It's theft. And if you want me to drive back there right now and put it back, I will." Martha stared at the money for a long moment. In all their years of marriage, through all their struggles and hardships, they'd never stolen anything. Robert had once driven 20 miles back to a hardware store to return a wrench that the clerk had accidentally given him for free. Martha had turned in a wallet containing $400 that she'd found in a parking lot, even though they'd needed money for Grace's dental work at the time. Honesty had been the foundation of their lives, the value they drilled into their children above all others. But now, looking at that bundle of hundreds, Martha felt something shift inside her. They'd survived something impossible. They'd found something that shouldn't exist. And the people who'd buried it had apparently decided it wasn't worth recovering, had written off $245 million like it was pocket change. "Don't take it back," she heard herself say. "Not yet. Let's think about this." "Think about what? We're talking about stealing government money, are we?" Martha turned to face him fully, her mind working through the ethics and legalities with the same rigor she'd once applied to teaching students about moral philosophy. That money has been abandoned for 36 years. The program it belonged to no longer exists. The man who authorized its burial is dead. The government apparently decided it wasn't worth recovering. At what point does abandoned property cease to be property at all? "That's rationalizing," Robert said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Maybe," Martha admitted. "Or maybe it's recognizing that there's a difference between what's legal and what's right. That money is doing nothing sitting in a hole. It's not helping anyone, not serving any purpose. Meanwhile, there are veterans sleeping on streets, families losing their homes, communities falling apart because the systems that are supposed to help them have failed." Robert looked at his wife of 50. 2 years. and saw something he'd seen before, but never quite like this. The fierce determination that had made her an exceptional teacher. The conviction that had driven her to spend her own money on supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure yet," Martha said honestly, "but I think we need to find out more about Operation Northwind, about Colonel Brennan, about why that money is really still there. And then we make a decision based on what we learn, not on fear or greed or what we're supposed to do according to rules made by people who wrote off $245 million like it was a rounding error." They didn't decide anything else that night. They were too exhausted, too overwhelmed, too aware that they were standing at a crossroads that would define everything that came after. Instead, they ordered pizza from a place down the street, ate in silence while watching mindless television, and fell asleep in their clothes, holding hands the way they'd done for 5 decades. The next morning brought clarity, or at least the illusion of it. Martha woke early and continued her research while Robert slept, his snores soft and familiar. She found more information about Colonel Brennan, about his career, about his reputation as someone who'd questioned authority when he thought authority was wrong. She found interviews he'd given after retirement, carefully worded, but suggesting a man who'd seen waste and corruption, and had tried to fight it from within, a system that didn't want to be fought. And she found one more thing, buried in the comments section of an obscure blog about Cold War history. Someone claiming to be Brennan's daughter had posted 3 years ago, responding to speculation about Operation Northwind. The comment read, "My father spent his last years haunted by what he called the buried future. He said they'd hidden resources that could have changed lives, helped people, done real good, but bureaucracy and fear had left them rotting in the ground. He hoped someday someone would find them and do what the government was too cowardly to do." Martha stared at those words for a long time. Then she woke Robert and showed him. They read it together in the thin morning light filtering through the motel curtains, and something unspoken passed between them. Permission, maybe, or absolution, or simply recognition that they'd been given an opportunity that came with terrible responsibility. "We take some of it," Robert said finally, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was suggesting. "Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough to make a real difference. We document everything, we use it carefully, and we help people who need help. We do what that money was supposed to do in the first place. Protect Americans who've fallen through the cracks." Martha nodded slowly. "And if they come for us? If someone finds out? Then we face whatever consequences come," Robert replied. "But at least we'll have tried to do something good with an accident that could have just been our death in a blizzard." They packed their things and checked out of the motel, driving not toward home, but back toward the cache. The decision had been made, though neither could point to the exact moment when possibility had become commitment. They were going to take some of the money. They were going to use it to help people. And they were going to hope that somewhere Colonel Brennan's ghost was watching and nodding in approval. The frozen ground had hidden $245 million for 36 years. Now 2 elderly survivors of an impossible storm were about to turn that frozen fortune into something warm, something alive, something that might just prove that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules that were made by people who'd forgotten what right even meant. The drive back to the cache took them 4 hours through roads that had been partially cleared by provincial plows, though the snowbanks on either side towered 8 feet high, creating narrow corridors of pavement that felt claustrophobic. Robert drove carefully, his hands steady on the wheel, while Martha sat beside him with her laptop open, still researching, still piecing together the puzzle that had quite literally frozen beneath their feet during the worst night of their lives. She'd found a forum for military historians, people who spent their retirement years documenting programs that the government would rather forget. She posted carefully, using a fake name, asking about Operation Northwind and Colonel Douglas Brennan without revealing what they'd found. Within hours, responses began appearing. An old Air Force logistics officer confirmed that Brennan had run several classified programs in the 80s. A former Pentagon accountant mentioned budget discrepancies that were never resolved. A journalist who'd tried to investigate Cold War black operations warned that people who dug too deep into Northwind often found themselves facing legal threats or worse. "Listen to this," Martha said, reading from her screen as Robert navigated a particularly treacherous curve. A guy named Victor Krauss worked under Brennan, deputy director of the program. There was apparently bad blood between them. Krauss was forced into early retirement in 1990, same year the program was being shut down. Rumor was he'd been caught skimming funds, but nothing was ever proven, so Brennan might have buried that money to keep it away from Krauss, Robert said thoughtfully. Made it look like a legitimate cache, but actually hid it where his deputy couldn't access it. Or maybe Brennan buried it legitimately, and Krauss has spent the last 30 years trying to find it, Martha countered. Either way, if this Krauss is still alive, and if there's any monitoring system on that cache, he might already know we've been there. The thought sent a chill through Robert that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. They were two elderly people who'd stumbled onto something that powerful men had fought over decades ago. If those fights were still ongoing, if those men were still alive and still interested in that money, then Robert and Martha had just painted targets on their backs. They reached the site just after noon. The landscape looked different in daylight. Less hostile. Almost serene. The mound that hid their truck was still there. But Robert had noted landmarks. Could find the exact spot. They spent 2 hours working in the bitter cold, digging down to the hatch again, opening it with less difficulty this time, now that the wheel lock had been broken free. This time they went down prepared. Robert had purchased a better flashlight in Whitehorse, along with a digital camera and waterproof bags. They photographed everything methodically, every case, every document, every detail of the chamber's construction. Martha took notes with her teacher's precision, documenting serial numbers from bills, dates from papers, measurements of the space itself. They were building a record, insurance against accusations that they were simply thieves who'd invented an elaborate story. Then came the hard part. They'd agreed to take $5 million, roughly 2% of the total. It was enough to make a real difference, but small enough that it might not be noticed if someone eventually came to recover the cash. They selected 5 cases carefully, ones from the back of the chamber that looked least likely to be checked first if anyone did an inventory. They carried them up one at a time, Robert's back screaming in protest, Martha's legs shaking with effort. They loaded the cases into the truck bed, covering them with tarps and camping gear to hide them from casual observation. Then Martha insisted on doing something that surprised Robert. She pulled out a waterproof bag and a notebook, wrote a detailed note explaining what they'd found, when they'd found it, and what they were taking. She included their names, address, phone number, and a promise that every dollar would be used to help people in need. She sealed the note and left it in one of the emptied cases. "If someone comes looking," she explained, "they deserve to know the truth. We're not criminals trying to hide. We're people who survived something impossible and found something that was being wasted. Let them judge us if they want, but let them judge us honestly." Robert sealed the hatch for the last time, covered it with snow, and they drove away with $5 million in the back of their truck. 2 ordinary people who just committed what might be the biggest theft of their lives, or might be the most justified act of civil disobedience since the Boston Tea Party. They weren't sure which, and that uncertainty sat between them like a living thing as they drove south toward Montana. They didn't drive straight home. Instead, they stopped in Helena, the state capital, because Martha had found something during her research that changed everything. There was a lawyer there named Patricia Summers who specialized in whistleblower cases and government accountability. She'd helped expose several black operations over the years, had a reputation for being both brilliant and careful, and according to her website, offered free initial consultations. If they were going to do this, if they were going to try to use that money without ending up in prison, they needed someone who understood how to navigate the dangerous territory between legal and necessary. Patricia Summers's office was in a converted Victorian house near the Capitol building, all hardwood floors and tall windows that let in weak winter sunlight. The lawyer herself was in her early 50s, with steel-gray hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. She listened without interrupting as Robert and Martha told their story, laying out photographs and documents on her conference table, showing her everything they'd found and everything they'd taken. When they finished, Patricia sat back in her chair and was quiet for a full minute, her fingers steepled under her chin. Finally she spoke. "This is the most insane thing anyone has ever brought to my office," she said flatly. "And I once represented a whistleblower who discovered the Pentagon had accidentally sold nuclear material to a scrapyard. So, you think we're crazy?" Martha said, her voice steady, despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I think you're honest, which is either very brave or very foolish," Patricia replied. She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Let me be clear about the legal situation. What you've described is technically federal property, even if it's been abandoned for 36 years. Taking any of it could be prosecuted as theft of government property, which carries serious penalties. However," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "the legal status of abandoned government caches from defunct Cold War programs is murky at best. There's almost no case law because these situations almost never come up. And if you were to use resources from such a cache to fund legitimate charitable work, documenting everything transparently, there's an argument that you're actually fulfilling the original intent of the program." "So, you'll help us?" Robert asked, hope rising in his chest. "I didn't say that," Patricia corrected. "I said I'd think about it. This is dangerous territory, Mr. and Mrs. Hayes. You're not just dealing with legal questions. You're dealing with people who might have vested interests in that money, staying hidden, or in recovering it themselves. You need to understand what you're walking into." She pulled out a file from her desk drawer, one that looked well worn, filled with clippings and notes. "I've been tracking Cold War black operations cases for 20 years. Operation Northwind has come up before, always on the periphery, always in whispers. There are people who've spent decades looking for those caches. Some of them are legitimate government recovery teams, others are treasure hunters. And some," she fixed them with a hard stare, "are former operatives who believe they have a personal claim to money they helped bury. Like Victor Krauss," Martha said. Patricia's eyebrows rose. "You know about Krauss?" "We know he worked under Colonel Brennan, that there was bad blood, that he was forced out right when the program shut down." "Then you should also know that Krauss has connections in law enforcement, in military contracting, in places where people don't ask too many questions about methods. If he's still alive and still looking, and if that cache had any kind of monitoring system, he might already know someone accessed it." Patricia closed the file. "Come back tomorrow. I need to make some calls, talk to people I trust, but if I take this case, you need to understand that we're not just fighting legal battles. We might be fighting for your safety." They left her office in a daze, checked into a motel on the outskirts of Helena, and tried to sleep despite the $5 million sitting in their truck just outside their door. Robert lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake. Martha curled against him, her breathing steady, but he could tell from the tension in her body that she wasn't sleeping either. "Are we doing the right thing?" he whispered. Into the darkness. "I don't know," Martha replied honestly, "but I know we can't just pretend we didn't find it. That money represents decades of wasted potential. If we can turn even a fraction of it into something good, into help for people who desperately need it, then maybe surviving that blizzard meant something. Maybe we were supposed to find it. Or maybe we're two old fools who should have left well enough alone." "Maybe," Martha agreed. "But we've been fools together for 52 years. Too late to stop now." The next morning, Patricia Summers called them back to her office. This time she had a plan, laid out in meticulous detail across her conference table. She'd spent the night consulting with former military lawyers, tax specialists, and civil rights advocates. The strategy she proposed was both audacious and carefully calibrated to provide maximum protection. "You establish a private foundation," she began, spreading documents across the table. "Call it something innocuous, the Hayes Family Foundation for Community Development. You seed it with a modest amount from your legitimate retirement savings, maybe $50,000. That gives it credibility and a paper trail." "Then what?" Martha asked. "Then the foundation begins receiving anonymous donations from a benefactor who wishes to remain unnamed. This is completely legal. Donors have no obligation to identify themselves if they structure their giving correctly. The foundation documents every dollar that comes in, pays all applicable taxes, and distributes funds to legitimate charitable causes with complete transparency." Robert leaned forward, understanding dawning. "So we're essentially cleaning the money through our own charity." "No," Patricia corrected firmly, her lawyer's precision cutting through the air like a blade. "Cleaning implies criminal proceeds. This is undocumented government property being redirected to public benefit through transparent, charitable channels. The distinction matters, both legally and morally. You're not hiding the money. You're making it visible, making it work, making it serve the purpose it was originally intended for, helping Americans in need. What happens next will turn this couple's good intentions into a fight for survival, reveal enemies they never knew they had, and force them to choose between safety and doing what's right. Stay with us to see how this unfolds. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Over the next week, Patricia worked with them to establish the legal framework. Articles of incorporation were filed. A bank account was opened with Robert and Martha's retirement savings as the initial deposit. Tax forms were submitted. Everything was done by the book, every I dotted and every T crossed with the precision of someone who knew that scrutiny would come eventually, and they needed to be ready for it. But while the legal machinery ground forward, Martha continued her research, digging deeper into Operation Northwind and the people who'd created it. What she found disturbed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The program hadn't just been about preparing for Soviet invasion. It had been part of a broader pattern of Cold War excess, of money disappearing into black budgets with minimal oversight, of programs that continued long after their justification had evaporated because people had built careers around them. She found congressional testimony from the early 90s when budget hawks had tried to investigate Cold War spending. Colonel Brennan had testified, and while most of his testimony remained classified, the unclassified portions painted a picture of a man increasingly disillusioned with the system he'd served. He'd argued that billions had been wasted, that resources meant to protect America had instead fed a bureaucratic machine that served no one but itself. More troubling, she found references to other people who'd asked questions about Operation Northwind. A journalist named Michael Torres, who'd been investigating the program in 1995 and had died in a car accident that police ruled suspicious but never solved. An accountant named Sarah Chen, who'd tried to audit Cold War expenditures and had lost her security clearance on fabricated charges, destroying her career. A pattern of people who'd gotten too close to the truth and had paid prices that ranged from professional destruction to death. "We need to be careful," Martha told Robert one evening as they sat in their modest living room, surrounded by documents and photographs. "This isn't just about money. People have been hurt for asking the questions we're asking. Then maybe we should stop asking," Robert said, but there was no conviction in his voice. They both knew they'd gone too far to turn back now. The foundation was established. The first donation of $500,000 had been processed. They'd already committed to the path that would either vindicate them or destroy them. The first grants from the Hayes Family Foundation went out 2 weeks later. $50,000 to a homeless veterans shelter that was about to close for lack of funding. $30,000 to a rural medical clinic that couldn't afford to stay open. $20,000 to a school district to buy supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. Small amounts compared to what they had access to, but life-changing for the recipients. Robert and Martha visited each recipient personally, wanting to see where the money went, wanting to ensure it was used as intended. The gratitude they encountered was overwhelming. The shelter director, a former Marine named Carl Washington, broke down crying when they told him about the grant. "I was going to have to turn away 30 guys," he said, his voice shaking. "Men who served their country and came home to nothing. You just saved lives." That night, driving home, Martha said, something that Robert would remember for the rest of his life. "Whatever happens to us, whatever consequences we face, that moment made it worth it. We gave that man hope, we saved those veterans." That's real, Robert, that's something no one can take away. But someone was already trying to take it away. They didn't realize it at first, didn't notice the black SUV that appeared on their street 3 days after the shelter visit, didn't think much of the stranger asking questions about them at the local diner. Didn't connect the dots until one evening when they came home to find their front door slightly ajar. Robert's hand stopped Martha before she could enter. He pulled out his phone, called 911, and they waited outside while police checked their house. Nothing was stolen, nothing was obviously disturbed. But someone had been inside, had gone through their papers, had searched their home office where they kept foundation documents. The police took a report but could do little else. No forced entry, no evidence left behind, no way to prove it wasn't just a door they'd forgotten to lock properly. That night, they couldn't sleep. They lay in bed listening to every creak, every sound, wondering if someone was watching, waiting. The next morning, Patricia Summers called. Her voice was tense. "We need to meet. Now. Not at my office, somewhere public." They met at a busy coffee shop in Helena, the kind of place where conversations disappeared into ambient noise and watching faces. Patricia looked like she hadn't slept. "Victor Krause is alive," she said without preamble. 78 years old, living in the Yukon Territory. "And 2 days ago, someone matching his son's description started making inquiries about you." "His son?" Martha's voice remained steady, but Robert could see her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "David Krause. 49 years old, former military contractor, discharged for financial irregularities. Now he works as a recovery specialist for people looking to reclaim assets. Which is a polite way of saying he helps wealthy clients recover things through methods that frequently border on illegal." Patricia pulled out a photograph from her bag, sliding it across the table. "Is this the man who's been asking about you?" Robert looked at the photo and felt his blood run cold. It was the same man he'd seen outside the diner, the one he'd dismissed as just another stranger passing through town. "Yes, that's him. Then you're in danger," Patricia said flatly. "The Krauses have been looking for Operation Northwind caches for decades. Victor believes they're rightfully his, that he earned them through his work on the program. If he knows you found one and took money from it, he's not going to just let it go." "So what do we do?" Martha asked. "Go to the police, the FBI? And tell them what? That you're being threatened over money you illegally removed from a government cache that isn't supposed to exist?" Patricia shook her head. "The moment you involve official law enforcement, you're admitting to theft of federal property. They'd have to investigate you, possibly arrest you. And while that's happening, David Krause would have plenty of time to make your lives very difficult in other ways." "So, we're trapped," Robert said quietly. "We can't report the theft from our house, can't go to authorities about the threats. Can't do anything except wait for them to make a move." "Not exactly," Patricia said, her eyes sharp. "There is one option. We go public with everything. The cash, the money, what you've done with it, and who's threatening you. We turn this into a story so big, so visible, that threatening you becomes impossible because the whole world is watching." Martha and Robert looked at each other, another one of their silent conversations happening in the space between heartbeats. Going public meant exposing themselves completely, meant facing judgment not just from the government but from everyone. It meant their grandchildren would see them on television, their neighbors would whisper, their lives would never be private again. But it also meant safety, or at least the closest thing to safety they could hope for now. "There's something you need to know first," Robert said quietly. He told Patricia about the note Martha had left in the cache, the one with their names and address. "If someone's already found that, they know who we are and where we live. We might not have the luxury of choosing when this becomes public." Patricia was quiet for a moment, processing this new information. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. "Rebecca? It's Patricia Summers. Remember that story you've been wanting to chase about Cold War black operations? I've got something better, much better. How fast can you get to Montana?" Rebecca Morrison, they later learned her name was actually Rebecca Chen. But Robert and Martha insisted she be identified differently in any written accounts to protect her privacy, arrived 2 days later. She was an investigative journalist for a major national outlet, the kind of reporter who'd built a career on exposing government waste and corruption. She spent 3 days with Robert and Martha, reviewing every document, examining every photograph, interviewing them for hours about the blizzard, the discovery, the decisions they'd made. She was skeptical at first, as any good journalist should be, but the evidence was overwhelming. The photographs were genuine. The GPS coordinates matched satellite imagery of the location. The money they'd taken had serial numbers that, when checked against federal databases through sources Rebecca wouldn't identify, and came back as part of a shipment that had disappeared into classified operations in 1987. Rebecca also did something that surprised them. She hired a private investigation firm to track the Krause family. What they found was damning. Victor Krause had indeed worked on Operation Northwind, but he'd been removed from the program not just for suspected theft, but for attempting to falsify recovery records. He'd tried to claim that certain caches had been recovered when they hadn't been, presumably planning to go back later and take the money for himself. Colonel Brennan had caught him, forced his retirement, and according to one heavily redacted document, had recommended criminal prosecution that was blocked by higher-ups who didn't want the scandal. David Krause had followed in his father's footsteps in all the worst ways. He'd worked as a military contractor in Iraq and Afghanistan, been discharged for diverting supplies meant for troops, and had spent the last 15 years helping wealthy clients recover lost assets through intimidation, legal threats, and occasional violence. He'd been sued twice, investigated 3 times, but had never been convicted of anything serious. He was, in essence, exactly the kind of person you didn't want, knowing you'd found $245 million in abandoned government money. "They're going to come after you," Rebecca said on her final day in Montana. "The question is whether they'll do it before or after my story publishes. If it's before, you're on your own and vulnerable. If it's after, you're protected by public attention, but exposed to government investigation." "What would you do?" Martha asked. Rebecca thought about it for a long moment. "I'd publish first, get the story out there with all the details about what you've found, what you've done with it, and who's threatening you. Make yourselves sympathetic figures before anyone can paint you as criminals. But I won't lie to you, there will be consequences. The Department of Justice will have to respond. You might face charges, but you'll also have public opinion on your side, and that matters more than you might think." They agreed to publication. Rebecca spent another week writing, fact-checking, preparing. She interviewed Carl Washington at the Veterans Shelter. She talked to families who'd received help with medical bills. She spoke to teachers whose classrooms now had supplies they couldn't have afforded before. She built a comprehensive picture not just of what Robert and Martha had found, but of what they'd done with it. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after their conversation at the coffee shop. The headline read, "Elderly Couple Survives Record Blizzard, Discovers $245 Million Cold War Cache, Turns It into Charity." It was picked up immediately by every major news outlet. By noon, news trucks were parked outside their modest house in Whitefish. By evening, their story was trending on social media. The response was immediate and overwhelming. veterans groups praised them, charitable organizations called them heroes. Political commentators debated the legal and ethical implications on cable news. Even some former government officials went on record saying that using abandoned Cold War resources to help Americans was exactly what the spirit of those programs had intended, even if the letter of the law was more complicated. But not everyone was supportive. The Department of Justice released a carefully worded statement acknowledging that certain contingency resources from Cold War-era programs may exist in remote locations, and that the department is reviewing the legal status of such resources and the appropriate disposition of any that are recovered. Legal experts interpreted this as the government punting, unwilling to prosecute sympathetic elderly people for what amounted to a political and bureaucratic nightmare they'd created themselves. More concerning was the silence from Victor and David Krause. For 3 days after the story broke, there was no word from them, no legal threats, no attempts at contact. Then, on Friday evening, Robert was taking out the trash when a black SUV pulled up to their curb. David Krause stepped out, wearing an expensive suit that looked wrong on him, like armor that didn't quite fit. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and professional, the kind that made polite threats sound like friendly advice. "I believe we should talk." Robert's hand instinctively moved to his phone in his pocket, ready to call police. "I have nothing to say to you." "Really?" "Because I have quite a bit to say to you." David walked closer, stopping just at the property line, careful not to technically trespass. "You've taken something that belongs to my family. My father spent 40 years building Operation Northwind. He deserves to benefit from it. And so do I." "It doesn't belong to you," Robert said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "It never did, and it belongs to you? 2 random people who got lucky in a storm?" David's smile was cold. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take me to that cache. You're going to help me recover everything that's there. And in exchange, I won't make your lives very, very difficult. I won't report you to federal authorities with evidence that's more damning than what's in that puff piece newspaper article. I won't tell everyone how you've been spending stolen money. And I especially won't pay visits to your daughter Grace and her family in Billings." The threat to Grace crossed a line so fundamental that Robert felt rage replace his fear. "You threaten my family, and we're done talking. I'll burn every dollar in that cash before I help you get 1 cent. David studied him for a long moment, seeming to reassess. "All right, family stays out of it, but the rest stands. You have 48 hours to decide. Help me recover that money, or face consequences you can't imagine." He climbed back into his SUV and drove away, leaving Robert standing in his driveway, trash bag forgotten at his feet. Inside, Martha had watched the entire exchange from the window. When Robert came in, she was already on the phone with Patricia Summers, her voice urgent but controlled. The lawyer listened, asked pointed questions, then said something that made Martha's face go pale. She hung up and looked at Robert with an expression that mixed determination with fear. "Patricia says we have to make a choice now. We can try to hide, hope the publicity protects us and Krause backs off. Or we can fight, expose him and his father completely, turn this into something so public that they have no choice but to back away. Fighting means putting ourselves even more in the spotlight," Robert said. "Means our lives become this story forever. Hiding means living in fear that they'll come back," Martha countered. "Means looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives, however long that is." They sat at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten thousands of meals, helped their children with homework, celebrated holidays, and weathered crises. Now, it was the table where they had to decide whether to expose themselves completely or live as targets. The choice felt impossible, the kind that would define not just their remaining years, but their entire legacy. Outside, the Montana winter night was clear and cold, stars brilliant against the darkness. Inside, 2 elderly people who'd survived the impossible prepared to do something even harder. Stand up against powerful people who wanted them silenced, using nothing but their story and the hope that truth still mattered more than threats. Robert and Martha, didn't sleep that night. They sat at their kitchen table as the hours crept past midnight, drinking coffee that had long gone cold, talking through possibilities and consequences with the kind of honesty that only 52 years of marriage could produce. The threat from David Kraus hung over them like a storm cloud, but beneath the fear was something else: anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, determined fury of people who'd spent their entire lives doing right and were tired of watching wrong people win. "We could run," Robert said around 3 in the morning, his voice hoarse from hours of talking. "Pack up, go stay with Michael in Seattle, let this blow over." "It won't blow over," Martha replied, staring at the photographs of their grandchildren on the refrigerator. "Men like Kraus don't just give up, they wait, they watch, and they strike when you think you're safe. We'd spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. So we fight. But how? We're 2 people in our 70s with no money for lawyers, no political connections, nothing but our story." Martha reached across the table and took his weathered hand in hers. "Our story is enough. It's always been enough. We survived -71 degrees because we prepared, because we stayed calm, because we didn't give up. This is just another kind of storm. We prepare, we stay calm, and we don't give up." By dawn, they'd made their decision. They called Patricia Summers first, then Rebecca Morrison. Within hours, they were all gathered in Patricia's office, planning not a defense but an offensive strike. If David Kraus wanted a fight, they'd give him one, but it would be fought in the court of public opinion, where the Kraus family's history of corruption and theft could be exposed in full daylight. Rebecca had been doing her own investigating since the first story broke. She'd found records of other people who'd been threatened by the Kraus family. Other potential witnesses to Victor Kraus's attempts to steal from Operation Northwind. She'd tracked down former colleagues of Colonel Brennan who'd suspected corruption but had been afraid to speak up. And she'd discovered something explosive. Evidence that Victor Kraus had been involved in the death of Michael Torres, the journalist who'd been investigating the program in 1995. "I can't prove it definitively," Rebecca admitted, spreading documents across Patricia's conference table. "But Torres was investigating Kraus specifically in the weeks before his car accident. He'd filed Freedom of Information requests about Kraus's involvement in Operation Northwind. He'd interviewed people who claimed Kraus had tried to recruit them into a scheme to illegally recover caches. Then suddenly his brakes failed on a mountain road and he drove off a cliff. The police ruled it suspicious, but never found evidence of tampering," Patricia added, pulling up the old police report on her laptop. "But Torres's editor told me he'd received an anonymous call 2 days before the accident, warning him to drop the investigation or there would be consequences." Robert felt sick. They weren't just dealing with greedy men trying to recover money. They were dealing with people who'd killed to protect their secrets and would kill again if they felt threatened enough. "We need to go to the FBI," he said. "This is murder we're talking about." "We will," Patricia replied. "But first, we need to make sure you're protected. Once federal investigators get involved, you lose control of the narrative. Rebecca's second story needs to publish before that happens, laying out the full history of the Kraus family's corruption and their connection to Colonel Brennan's death." "Brennan died of a heart attack 5 years ago," Martha said, confused. "Officially, yes," Rebecca said grimly. "But I found his daughter, Sarah Brennan. She's a history professor in Oregon, and she's been trying for years to get someone to investigate her father's death. He was 73, in excellent health, no history of heart problems. He died 3 days after writing a letter to a congressman asking for a full audit of Operation Northwind's final accounting. The medical examiner who did his autopsy retired 6 months later with a surprising amount of money for someone on a government salary. The pieces were falling into place, revealing not just theft, but decades of murder, intimidation, and corruption. Victor Kraus hadn't just been skimming from the program. He'd been willing to kill anyone who got in his way. and his son had learned those same brutal lessons. Robert and Martha sat in Patricia's office, two elderly people from Montana who'd wanted nothing more than to see the Northern Lights one last time, and realized they'd stumbled into something that could either get them killed or expose one of the darkest secrets of the Cold War. "We'd do it," Martha said finally, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "We tell everything. We work with the FBI. We help Rebecca expose them completely. Because if we don't, someone else will find another cache someday, and the Kraus family will threaten them too. This has to end." Rebecca's second story published 3 days later, and it was devastating. The dark side of Operation Northwind, murder, corruption, and a family's decades-long crime spree, laid out everything they'd discovered about Victor and David Kraus. It included interviews with former military personnel who'd witnessed Victor's theft attempts. It detailed the suspicious deaths of Michael Torres and Colonel Brennan. It exposed David's history of violence and intimidation in his asset recovery work. And it included a statement from Robert and Martha, recorded on video, explaining exactly what David Kraus had threatened when he appeared at their home. The response was immediate and explosive. The FBI opened an official investigation into both Kraus men within hours of publication. Federal agents raided their properties in the Yukon Territory and found exactly what Rebecca's sources had suggested they'd find: maps of cache locations, plans for illegal recovery operations, and most damning of all, communications between Victor and David discussing eliminating obstacles to their work. The same phrase had appeared in Michael Torres's notes about their threat to him days before his death. Victor Kraus, 78 and suddenly facing murder charges, suffered what his lawyers claimed was a stress-induced stroke. He was hospitalized under guard, unable to communicate, his empire of carefully maintained lies crumbling around him. David Kraus tried to flee to Mexico, but was arrested at the border, found with $200,000 in cash and a fake passport. The asset recovery specialist had apparently been preparing his own escape route for years. With the Kraus family neutralized, Robert and Martha finally felt safe enough to fully cooperate with federal investigators. A team from the Department of Justice arrived in Whitefish 2 weeks after David's arrest, led by a senior investigator named Margaret Chen, who'd spent 15 years tracking Cold War financial irregularities. She was thorough but fair, treating Robert and Martha not as criminals but as witnesses to a much larger crime. They took her to the cache, flying by helicopter this time instead of driving, and watched as a full recovery team documented everything. The site was exactly as they'd left it, minus the 5 cases they'd removed. Margaret's team photographed every container, inventoried every dollar, and confirmed what Robert and Martha had reported. $245 million in 1980s-era $100 bills, perfectly preserved, sitting in a vault that had been forgotten by everyone except the criminals who'd wanted to steal it. "You could have taken all of it," Margaret said to them during one of their interviews, conducted in a hotel conference room with lawyers present. "You knew no one was coming back for it. You could have disappeared, lived like royalty for the rest of your lives. Why didn't you?" Martha answered without hesitation, "Because that money wasn't ours to take. It was the American people's money, buried during a time of fear and waste. If we'd stolen it, we'd have been no better than the Kraus family. But if we could use some of it to help people the government had forgotten, people who'd served their country or fallen through the cracks of systems that were supposed to catch them, then maybe it could finally serve the purpose it was meant to serve." "And the note you left?" Margaret continued. "You put your names and address in writing, knowing that could lead investigators right to you." "Why?" Robert smiled. "Because we're not criminals. We're 2 people who survived something impossible and found something that needed to be found. If we'd tried to hide, we'd have been admitting we did something wrong. We didn't. We did something necessary." The Department of Justice spent 3 months reviewing the case, analyzing the legal precedents, and consulting with everyone from Cold War historians to ethics professors. The complexity of prosecuting 2 sympathetic elderly people for taking a tiny fraction of money from an abandoned government cache that shouldn't have existed in the first place proved overwhelming. More importantly, Robert and Martha's complete transparency and their charitable use of the funds made them impossible villains. The final decision came down from the Attorney General herself in a press conference that was broadcast nationally. After thorough review, the Department of Justice has determined that no charges will be filed against Robert and Martha Hayes. While the taking of government property is normally a serious offense, the unique circumstances of this case, the abandonment of the cash for over 3 decades, and the charitable purpose to which the funds were directed lead us to conclude that prosecution would not serve the interests of justice. However, the Hayes family has agreed to return the remaining funds in their possession to the government, and all Operation Northwind cashes that are recovered will be properly accounted for and the funds returned to the Treasury. Robert and Martha watched the press conference from their living room, surrounded by family. Grace had driven up from Billings with her teenage boys. Michael had flown in from Seattle. Sarah had come from Colorado. All 3 of their children held their hands as the Attorney General continued. I also want to note that the investigation into the Kraus family's criminal activities, which began because of Mr. and Mrs. Hayes's courage in coming forward, has revealed decades of corruption and at least 2 murders. Without their willingness to expose this conspiracy, these crimes would have remained hidden. The American people owe them gratitude, not prosecution. The room erupted in cheers and tears. Grace hugged her mother so hard, Martha's ribs ached. Michael kept saying, "I can't believe you too," over and over. Sarah, the professor, was already talking about writing an academic paper about the ethics of civil disobedience in cases of government waste. But Robert and Martha just held each other, feeling the weight they'd carried for months finally lift. The Hayes Family Foundation continued its work, though now funded by Robert and Martha's modest retirement income and legitimate donations from people inspired by their story. The remaining money they'd taken, about $4 million after their initial grants, was returned to the government as promised, but the impact of that $4 million would ripple outward for years. The veterans' shelter they'd saved stayed open and expanded, eventually serving over 300 homeless veterans annually. Carl Washington, the director, started a program to help vets transition to civilian employment, funded by donations that poured in after Robert and Martha's story went national. He credited them with not just saving his shelter, but with inspiring a movement to better serve those who'd served. The rural medical clinic they'd funded used the money to buy equipment that allowed them to serve twice as many patients. The school district that received supplies started a program where teachers could request materials without having to pay out of pocket, something that had been Martha's dream her entire teaching career. Every grant they'd made multiplied, creating ripples of positive change that touched thousands of lives. But perhaps the most unexpected impact came from something neither Robert nor Martha had anticipated. Their story inspired others to think differently about resources, about waste, about the responsibility of ordinary people when they encounter extraordinary situations. Within a year, 3 other abandoned Cold War caches were discovered by hikers and hunters who came forward immediately, inspired by the Hayes example. The government recovered over $400 million in forgotten funds and, under pressure from public opinion, established a program to properly account for all Cold War black operations expenditures and recover remaining caches. More importantly, Congress passed legislation requiring transparency in classified spending programs, making it harder for money to simply disappear into black budgets and be forgotten. The Hayes Amendment, as it became known informally, mandated regular audits of classified operations and required decommissioned programs to properly account for all assets within 5 years of shutdown. It was a small victory in the battle against government waste, but it was something. Sarah Brennan, Colonel Brennan's daughter, reached out to Robert and Martha 6 months after the Attorney General's announcement. She drove to Montana specifically to meet them, carrying with her a box of her father's personal effects that she'd been saving. Inside were journals, photographs, and a letter her father had written shortly before his death but never sent, addressed simply, "To whoever finds what we buried." They read it together in Robert and Martha's living room, the afternoon sun streaming through windows, tea getting cold on the coffee table. Colonel Brennan's handwriting was precise, military, each letter carefully formed, even as his message revealed a man tormented by conscience. "I buried $245 million in the Canadian wilderness," he'd written. "I told myself it was following orders, preparing for contingencies, protecting America. But I knew even then that it was waste, that the money would have been better spent on veterans' care or education or infrastructure. I knew Victor Krauss was corrupt, that he'd try to steal what we'd buried, so I hid it where even he couldn't find it. I hoped the government would recover it properly when the Cold War ended. They didn't. Now I'm an old man, and I realize that all I did was bury treasure that could have changed lives. If someone finds it someday, I hope they're braver than I was. I hope they use it the way it should have been used all along." Sarah was crying by the time Martha finished reading aloud. "My father was a good man trapped in a bad system," she said. "He did what he could within the rules, but those rules protected waste and corruption. You did what he wished he'd had the courage to do. You broke the rules that needed breaking." "We were just trying to do right," Robert said quietly. "Your father buried that money thinking it would protect America. We just wanted it to actually do that, even if it was 40 years late." Sarah stayed for dinner, sharing stories about her father, learning about Robert and Martha's life and their own military service. Robert's decades keeping power lines running, Martha's years teaching children to read and think and dream. By the time she left, she'd become more than just Colonel Brennan's daughter. She'd become a friend, someone who understood that sometimes doing right means disappointing the people who expect you to follow rules that have stopped making sense. A year after surviving the blizzard, Robert and Martha were invited to speak at a veterans event in Washington, D.C. They'd resisted public speaking, uncomfortable with attention, preferring to work quietly through their foundation. But Carl Washington had asked personally, and they couldn't say no to the man whose shelter they'd saved. They stood on a stage in front of 500 veterans and their families, two elderly people in their Sunday best, looking uncomfortable under spotlights. Robert gripped the podium while Martha stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. He'd written a speech but abandoned it after the first sentence, choosing instead to speak from the heart. "We're not heroes," he began, his voice rough but steady. "We're just two people who got lucky and tried to share that luck. But I want to tell you what we learned from all of this, from surviving that blizzard and finding that money and facing down people who wanted us dead. We learned that the system doesn't always work, that sometimes money meant to protect people ends up forgotten in a hole, that sometimes the only way to make things right is to break rules that have stopped serving their purpose." He paused, looking out at faces scarred by war and hardship and time. "Every one of you served this country. You made sacrifices most people can't imagine. And too many of you came home to systems that failed you, to bureaucracies that lost your paperwork, or denied your claims or just didn't care. That's wrong. That's a waste worse than any buried money. So we're not here to tell you we're heroes. We're here to tell you that when you find waste, when you find money or resources being squandered while people suffer, you have a responsibility to do something about it. Even if it's scary, even if it's risky, because doing nothing is worse." The applause started slowly, then built into a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Veterans who'd lost limbs, who'd lost friends, who'd lost faith in systems that promised to care for them, stood and clapped and cried. Not because Robert and Martha had saved them personally, but because they'd proven that ordinary people could still make a difference, that conscience could still matter more than rules. After the speech, they were surrounded by well-wishers, but one man stood apart, waiting patiently. He was in his late 50s, wearing a suit that suggested success, and when he finally approached, Martha recognized him immediately, even though she hadn't seen him in 40 years. "Mrs. Hayes," he said tentatively, "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Tommy Richardson. You told me my volcano project was good when I was in 9th grade. Martha's eyes filled with tears. Tommy, of course I remember. You became a geologist, wrote me that letter saying I'd changed your life. You did, he said simply, and now you've done it again. I've spent my career working for oil companies, making good money but doing work I wasn't proud of. When I saw your story, saw what you did with that money, how you risked everything to help people, I realized I'd been making the wrong choices. I quit my job. I'm starting a non-profit to provide clean water in areas where fracking has contaminated wells. It won't make me rich, but it's right. You taught me that in 9th grade, and you reminded me of it now. He handed Martha an envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000, the seed money for his new organization. I want to be the kind of person you taught me to be, he said. It just took me 40 years to find the courage. After he left, Robert and Martha stood together in the emptying hall, holding each other the way they had in that tent when the temperature dropped to -71 and death waited just beyond the fabric walls. They'd survived that night by staying together, by not giving up, by believing tomorrow would come. Now they'd survived something arguably harder, the temptation of fortune, the threat of violence, the judgment of a nation watching their every move. Was it worth it? Robert asked quietly. All the fear, all the stress, all the danger. Martha thought about Carl Washington's shelter, about the clinic that stayed open, about Tommy Richardson finding his conscience, about the Hayes Amendment that would make it harder for future government waste, about the 3 children sleeping safely because their parents hadn't been destroyed by greed or fear, about 52 years of marriage that had prepared them for exactly this moment. Every second, she said. Every single second. They flew home the next day, returning to their modest house in Whitefish, where the floors still creaked and the furnace still needed repairs. Their grandchildren came to visit, wide-eyed with stories they'd heard at school about their grandparents who'd survived an impossible storm and found an impossible fortune and done the impossible thing of using it to help others instead of themselves. Robert took his eldest grandson, 15-year-old Daniel, out to the garage to show him how to change oil in the old truck that had carried them through the blizzard. As they worked together, hands growing dirty with grease, the way Robert's had been dirty for 43 years of lineman work, Daniel asked the question that Robert had been waiting for. "Grandpa, were you scared when you found all that money and those bad men came after you?" Robert was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer honestly without frightening a child, about how to pass on the lesson that mattered most. "Yeah, I was scared. Terrified, actually. But being scared doesn't mean you stop doing what's right. It means you do what's right, even though you're scared. That's what courage actually is. Is that why you gave the money back? Because you were scared of getting in trouble?" "No," Robert said firmly. "We gave it back because it wasn't ours to keep. We took enough to help some people who desperately needed help, and that was right. But keeping all of it would have been wrong, no matter how much we could have used it or how much we wanted it. The point isn't that we were noble. The point is that we were honest with ourselves about what was right and what was wrong, and we chose right even when wrong would have been easier." Daniel nodded slowly, processing this with the seriousness of 15. "When I grow up, I want to be like you and Grandma. Someone who does right things even when they're hard." Robert pulled his grandson into a hug, getting grease on both their shirts, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was the real treasure they'd found, not the $245 million buried in frozen ground, but the chance to show their children and grandchildren and anyone else watching that ordinary people could still make extraordinary choices, that integrity mattered more than wealth, that doing right mattered more than doing easy. That evening, after their grandchildren had left and the house was quiet again, Robert and Martha sat on their back porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded them of that last sunset before the blizzard had hit. They were 74 and 73 now, a year older, infinitely wiser, carrying scars both physical and emotional from the journey they'd survived. "Do you ever think about that night in the tent?" Martha asked, echoing the same question she'd asked a year ago. "When it was -71 and we thought we were going to die." "Every day," Robert admitted. "I think about how close we came to never seeing another sunrise. About how lucky we were to have that tent, to have each other, to survive something that should have killed us. Do you think we were meant to find that money? That surviving the blizzard and setting up our tent in that exact spot was somehow fate or destiny or God's plan?" Robert considered the question seriously, the way he always did when Martha asked something philosophical. "I don't know about fate, but I know we made choices. We chose to be prepared for the worst. We chose to stay calm when the storm hit. We chose to work together instead of panicking alone. And when we found that money, we chose to use it to help others instead of helping ourselves. Those were all choices, not fate. And I think that's more important. Fate is just luck, good or bad. But choices are who we are." Martha took his weathered hand in hers, feeling the calluses from decades of work, the strength that remained despite age, the steadiness that had kept them alive and kept them honest. "Then I'm glad we chose each other 53 years ago. Because every choice since then has been easier with you beside me." They sat together as the sun slipped below the horizon. Two people who'd survived the impossible and then used that survival to inspire something even more impossible. Proof that given a choice between greed and generosity, between selfishness and service, ordinary people would often choose extraordinary goodness. The frozen ground had hidden $245 million for 36 years. But what Robert and Martha Hayes discovered was worth far more than money. They discovered that survival is just the beginning, that second chances should be shared, and that sometimes the coldest nights lead to the warmest hearts. 3 years after the blizzard, Robert and Martha received an unexpected call. The government had finally recovered all the remaining Operation Northwind caches, totaling over $600 million. As a result of the Hayes Amendment requiring transparency in handling recovered funds, Congress had voted to establish a trust fund using a portion of the recovered money to support programs for veterans, rural health care, and educational supplies, exactly the causes Robert and Martha's foundation had championed. Moreover, the government was offering Robert and Martha a finder's fee, 5% of the value of the cash they'd discovered, standard for recovery of lost government property. $12 million, legally theirs, with no strings attached. They could accept it without guilt, without fear, without consequence. It was the fortune they could have stolen but didn't, now being offered to them legitimately as recognition of their honesty and their courage. They sat in their living room, looking at the official letter, the number seeming impossible even after everything they'd been through. $12 million. Enough to buy a mansion, travel the world, leave their grandchildren trust funds that would last generations. Everything they'd never had during decades of hard work and modest living. "What do we do with it?" Martha asked quietly. Robert smiled, the decision already made in his heart. "We put it in the foundation, every penny. We hire staff so other people can do the work of distributing it. We make sure it helps people for years after we're gone. We turn $12 million into hundreds of lives changed, thousands of families helped, communities rebuilt. We do exactly what we did with the first 5 million, just bigger." Martha kissed him, the kind of kiss that contained 53 years of marriage, 3 children raised, countless crises weathered together, and one impossible fortune turned into something beautiful. "I love you, Robert Hayes. I've loved you since you were a boy who watched me encourage a kid at a science fair. And I've never been more proud of you than right now." The Hayes Family Foundation became one of the largest charitable organizations in Montana, then expanded to neighboring states, eventually going national. Robert and Martha stayed involved until their health wouldn't allow it, then watched with pride as younger people they'd mentored took over the work. They never took salaries, never lived any differently than they had before the blizzard, never forgot that the money they were distributing had come from luck and choice in equal measure. When Robert passed away at 82, the funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched. Veterans he'd helped house, families he'd supported through medical crises, teachers whose classrooms he'd equipped, and Martha, and his wife of 61 years, who held his hand as he died, the same way she'd held it in that tent when they'd both thought they'd die together. Martha lived another 4 years, long enough to see their foundation surpass $50 million in grants distributed, long enough to watch all 3 grandchildren graduate college with scholarships funded by the program she and Robert had started, long enough to finish writing a book about their experience that became required reading in ethics classes across the country. On her last day, surrounded by children and grandchildren, she was asked if she had any regrets about the choices they'd made, about taking that money, about the danger they'd faced, about the life they could have had if they'd kept it all for themselves. She smiled, her mind still sharp even as her body finally gave out. "No regrets," she said firmly. "We could have been rich and miserable, knowing we'd stolen from our country and kept it for ourselves. Instead, we were honest and happy, knowing we'd used an accident of fate to help people who needed help. Money can't buy that kind of peace. Can't buy the knowledge that you did right when doing wrong would have been easier. Can't buy integrity. We died poor in dollars and rich in everything that actually matters. No regrets at all. Anyone can choose generosity over greed if they're brave enough to believe that sharing fortune creates more value than hoarding it. Because in the end, it's not about what we survive or what we find. It's about what we do with those gifts that defines who we really are." Robert and Martha Hayes survived -71 degrees Celsius in a tent that should have been their tomb. They found $245 million that should have stayed buried forever. And they chose honor over fortune, integrity over wealth, service over selfishness. That choice didn't just change their lives. It changed the definition of what ordinary people are capable of when they refuse to accept that doing right is impossible just because it's hard. The frozen ground had hidden a fortune. But 2 hearts warmed by love and conscience proved that the greatest treasure isn't what you find, it's what you do with it. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep exploring the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that the best treasures aren't the ones we keep, but the ones we share.